Good afternoon all, and welcome to this plenary session with the title Arctic Eruption and Aviation in Volcanic Ash. I'll be the chair of this session, and my name is Árni Guðbrandsson, and I come from the Air Navigation Division at Isavia. We'll have three speakers here today. Ásgeir Pálsson, who is Director of Air Navigation Services at Isavia, Vilhjálmur Þór Arnarsson, Captain and Director of Safety, Icelandair, and Ingvar Kristinsson, the Managing Director at Icelandic Met Office. Ásgeir and Vilhjálmur will have a joint presentation here today, where they will focus on why the 2010 Eyjafjallajökull eruption caused such a big disruption in the aviation world. And then the second part is about where are we today in regards to aviation and volcanic ash. And then they will be followed by Ingvar from the Icelandic Met Office. I would like to give the floor now to the speakers, Ásgeir and Vilhjálmur. Go ahead.
Good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. And for those of you who are visiting Iceland, I hope you have enjoyed your stay. We have tried to give you an example of all the weathers we have here in Iceland for the last few days. Hope you enjoyed that. Volcanic eruption in the Arctic region. This image shows us the combined ash distribution from Mount Eyjafjallajökull when it erupted in 2010, and you can see how widespread it was. And to give you a little bit of an idea of the magnitude of the erupted area from this volcano, it was 480 billion kilograms, and thereof 80% of that was air distributed. So even though we have an eruption which is not in the Arctic region can be greatly affected by a volcanic eruption. This is Icelandair network, just to give you a little bit of insight into my airline. Our business case is to gather people in Europe, fly them to Keflavik, and then onwards to North America and vice versa. So if the airspace around our airport is contaminated with volcanic ash, it gives us quite a headache, as you can imagine. So we are an airline situated on a volcano island with 30 active volcanoes, and we have to have a good relationship with our volcanoes, but as in any or in all relationships, we can have eruptions, and we have to be able to deal with them. And for over 30 years at Icelandair, we have been training, especially our pilots, with dealing with volcanic flights, if we deal with volcanic ash in the air, stuff like that. And our main focus has been to get the flight safely back on the ground. That's been like at least until 2010.
Okay. Good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. This is a depiction, or actually a snapshot taken in August, but this is a normal day at noontime, showing the traffic. So you can see that the density of traffic in this area is quite heavy. That means that if there's an eruption and volcanic ash going into the atmosphere, the aircraft that have to be moved around and have to go about this is quite significant. Then what happened in Eyjafjallajökull was actually a catalyst. There had been incidents before that happened, and also plans had been made, and I'll come back to that later. But the necessity of change was really put forward after Eyjafjalla and during the Eyjafjallajökull eruption. What happened there was that basically you see here volcanic ash charts from the London BAC, as it's called, Volcanic Ash Center, which is co-located with the UK Met Office. And to be And this is one chart from ground up to 20,000 feet. So it shows the light blue area, which is density between 200 micrograms per cubic meter and up to 2,000. So during the first few days, the limit that was put was the 200. So you can see that's a much wider area than when you go up to 2,000. It was only after almost a week that the limit of the areas that were closed was put up to 2,000, but I'll get back to that. There were, of course, a lot of arguments, a lot of upset people, a lot of upset airline executives that happened, but not everybody was suffering. For example, the Oslo taxi company had a good time. And John Cleese took a taxi from Oslo to Brussels, 3,330 pounds. And he was very happy with that, and there were a lot of other taxi rides. And I imagine also a lot of stops. I've even seen amorous films made about this incident where it forced people to be together and stuff like that. So basically, not everything was bad about this, and also one good thing, we got a new system, which we'll get back to later.
So, when we visioned the volcanic ash, this is how we saw it. We saw clouds filled with ash, and we could try to avoid them. But in 2010, we experienced that we couldn't see the ash. It was the fine ash which was invisible to the naked eye. And when dealing with this, we can see that we have looking at for short-term and a long-term effects. Come back to that a little bit later.
Okay, so now let's look at why did things go the way they went. And we can put this into three categories or three elements that are contributing to the events. First, if we take the scientific, which is basically the modeling, the ash distribution, the meteorological information, the fallout from the ash cloud, that was really not defined very clearly. So basically what the London WAC did, which is responsible for this area, according to the International Civil Aviation Organization, the London WAC is the only one responsible for this area. So even though there were other informations coming in from other volcanic ash offices, they were not the official information. So they didn't really have a clear line on what to put out there as the safety level. So they put up first this 200 micrograms per cubic meter. So, and also the modeling, the information into the model and everything was under discussion. The second element in this is the engineering. What exactly could the engines withstand? And what was safe for the airplane and the people on board? That was almost non-existent. There were no formal statements from manufacturers or anything, what was safe for the engines. So basically, you didn't have that element in there to base on and then put into the scientific part. The only thing that actually the air traffic management part, which the air traffic control and associated issues, was actually had a very good plan, both for the North Atlantic and Europe. And those plans were put in place, and they, of course, caused the closures based on the scientific, which was questionable, and the engineering, which was non-existent. So that's why we had the problem. So now it's a question, where did you go from there?
So when we discuss what has changed from the airline perspective, we can say that in 2010, the airspace was closed, and we had no options to do anything. If the airspace was closed, we couldn't fly. So if you remember the image from earlier when I showed you our network, it was quite a difficult task for Icelandair to deal with this, as the airspace around Keflavik, our home base, was mainly closed. So in ways to manipulate this, we couldn't do anything. We couldn't fly within the airspace as it was closed, so we had to do some other things, which was we moved our base to Akureyri for a part of time in the northern part of the country. which was a huge task for us. And then also for some days or weeks, we moved the base all the way to Glasgow, so we could still continue to gather people around Europe and get them to North America. So what has changed now is that the airspace will not be closed for operation. We learned that, as Ásgeir said earlier, that we needed more information, and we have done a lot of research on that, what the engines can withstand and so forth, and some things like that. And the legislation has changed to put it in such a way that the responsibility is now with the airlines to perform a risk assessment on their operation, and they have to submit that risk assessment to the regulators to get approvals to operation within contaminated airspace. So each airline has to perform its own risk assessment, which is based on guidance material from the regulator and from ICAO, and is approved. So if you look at the ideas that I mentioned earlier about short term, then we are talking about things like we are on a flight and that flight is affected by volcanic gas. There is some engine problems and something is affecting that particular flight. How to deal with that hasn't changed much since 2010. What has changed most significantly is the long-term effects. When we have fine ash which gathers within the engines and stuff and starts to build up and reduces the engine life. How are we dealing with that to make sure that that doesn't compromise our flights? And that's where we have relied on more scientific data, more scientific research, and so on.
So from the air navigation services and the regulatory services, state regulators, what has this changed? As pointed out by Willi, the responsibility has been shifted from the regulatory side and the airspace services over to the airlines to make the evaluation, and they can use whatever approved information that they can get. The question might be, well, that means, of course, not that the air navigation services have nothing to do now. Volcanic ash will still make a disruption in where you can fly, and that will require a slightly different management of the air traffic flows. You might ask, why was this done long before this happened? Well, some parts of it were, but this is what is called a sort of a low risk but high impact occurrence. It doesn't happen often, and it didn't happen so very often before. The reason was that you had a few occurrences in Indonesia and Alaska with serious impact on aircraft. But basically, the jet age started somewhat about 50 years ago. And before that time, we had prop airplanes and propeller-driven piston engines are not as sensitive to volcanic ash as jet engines are. And they were not flying at those levels, those altitudes where this fine ash stays up a long time. So the impact wasn't really there. So that's maybe one of the reasons, and also that this is a low risk, that means it doesn't happen often, but the impact was severe. So we have to, one of the final messages from the air navigation side is that we need to look at detailed planning for low risk but high impact occurrences, and it has to take into account all the controlling elements. And that was, I'm referring back to what I talked to. You have the scientific, the engineering, and the air traffic management side of it, and you have to think of all these elements if you have a coherent plan, to have a coherent plan.
So what has changed for the passenger? If we, as we see it now, it's less likely that we will have anything similar to disruptions to air travel as we had in 2010, as we know a lot more about volcanic ash, the effects it has, and also there's been a lot of research done. And also, one thing that is something to keep in mind is airlines might be affected differently, as each airline performs their own risk assessment and has to look at their own operation. They can have different things within their operations which makes them more vulnerable to volcanic ash than others. So that's something that we might see in the future, that there can be different reactions between different airlines. But with more research and scientific knowledge, there will be less uncertainty, especially on the effects and the ash distribution, and someone who is much more suited to talk about that than me, I'll give the word to Ingvar.
Thank you.
Yes, good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. I will shortly give you an overview of how we see it from the Icelandic Meteorological Office, how we're dealing with the ash in the atmosphere, and how that is really making some effect on the aviation in the Arctic area. First of all, the Icelandic Met Office is also a state volcano observatory, meaning that we have the obligatory to really monitor and observe all our volcanoes and give some information if there's something are changing in these volcanoes, if there are some uncertainty, and we have to raise the flag and tell them if there is something going on. But the duty on whether they are going to fly or not to fly is in the hand of the airlines, like William was pointing out just previously. That means, of course, that we have to deliver and we have to be make available all the data that is available from the Icelandic volcanoes. And that is something that we are continuously working on. We are working on open and free data policy. And so more or less all the data that we are providing should be open and free for everybody to use. And of course, it is very important that all the scientific world make use of this data that we are providing and help the airlines to really make their better decisions on a long term. But I am the Managing Director of the Forecast and Warning, and this slides has been made in cooperation with my colleague Sara Basotti, who is the coordinator for volcanic hazards. She would definitely like to be with you here today, but unfortunately she needs to go to Italy, where she is originated. But okay. The volcanoes that we have in the Arctic is the Alaskan ones, we have Russian volcanoes, we have Icelandic volcanoes, and we have one located within Norwegian and on Jan Mayen. And that is more or less the only volcano that is located in the Arctic. But all the others are influencing the Arctic area in some area. This is a more broader overview of where these volcanoes are located. There are 32 active volcano systems in Iceland. There are several in Alaska, and there are several in Russia as well. And then we have this one in Jan Mayen, which is the only one within the Arctic Circle. But all the other volcanoes, and especially these Icelandic ones, we have the potential to produce ash and travel into the Arctic areas, and then have some effects on the aviation in that area. Okay, why? Why is this ash coming from? First of all, there are more than 30 active volcanoes in Iceland. Two of them we are not monitoring quite well, and we have seen they are in Snæfellsnes, and they have not been active in the past years, and we are not monitoring them quite thoroughly, so we do not exactly know, but these two are not active as we see it. They erupt on average on 3 to 4 years, more or less. So meaning now that the last eruption that we had was in 2014, that it's most likely that we have one not later than the next year. That's what the scientists are telling me. But these Hekla, Katla, Bárðarbungur, and Grímsvötn, they are purely explosive, meaning that they are producing ash into the atmosphere. Of course, in some sense, they are also purely effusive, meaning that they are more or less just producing some lava, which have a very limited effect on the aviation. Of course, the last one from Bárðarbunga in Holuhraun was purely effusive, and of course made some gases into the atmosphere, but mainly just a lava from there. So what causes the explosivity? That is the presence of water. That is clearly one of the most difficult things, that if we have water coming out from the eruptions, linked with the eruptions, then we have this explosive factor, and that makes this ash coming out from into the atmosphere. But also, we have in Hekla, it's a high viscosity magma that is really also causing some ash into the atmosphere. And from the Icelandic volcanoes, more or less, majority of them can in somehow produce ashes. So they are very limited on the northern part, and the center part that are purely the opposite, that is not going to make any volcanic acid into the atmosphere. If you look at Grímsvötn 2011, then we had a total different wind directions than we had in the 2010 Eyjafjallajökull, which was for the main wind direction was in northwest, meaning that the ash traveled from to the south into the Europe, and then further up, like Ásgeir was showing you previously, into the Arctic area. But for example, the effect from 2011 Grímsvötn on the aviation was very much limited. Okay, first of all, it lasted only for 4 or 5 days, but the Eyjafjallajökull was 28 days, so that of course has an effect. But the total ash that went into the atmosphere was about tenfold more than it was in the Eyjafjallajökull. So the total ash in the atmosphere was much more than it was in Eyjafjallajökull. So that would definitely have affected the aviation in the Arctic at that time. So from our catalog, we have issued a catalog of Icelandic volcanoes. That was one of the projects that we decided to take up after the Eyjafjallajökull 2011. So now we can see that more or less all the majority of the ash is going out to the north, both from Grímsvötn and from Hekla, and sometimes into the east as well. So that will affect the Arctic quite clearly. And for example, we are simulating and making some run of the models on a daily basis from different scenarios for different volcanoes. Here is one from Katla, which was made in 2016. So you can see that it's very likely that it is going to the east and then further up to the north. That is the key factor here. Like I say, we have this beautiful catalog, IcelandicVolcanoes.is, and you can have a look and see what we have there. That is a catalog information on all Icelandic volcanoes, includes historical activity, current seismicity, possible hazards, and several other good information. And you quickly look, for example, if you have a look at Grímsvötn, you can see that we have some short descriptions on the volcano, telling us what we might be expecting and what the information we have there. Then further on, we have several detailed descriptions on general of several different things. But probably the most interesting part of this is that we have a very much lot of information that is on geographical based. For example, here we have the tephra flows, we have the lava flows, and here you have the basic information about this, for example, one of the tephra flows. So, Holuhraun 2014, and based on the previously on our average, we should expect some eruption next year. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Does anybody have any questions for the speakers? There are microphones at the stand at the corridors here.
Good afternoon, gentlemen. I'm a French student here in exchange, and I'm doing cooperative studies back in France at the Paris airport. And I was wondering, seeing all this roaring stuff about the impact of an eruption. You know, the eruption in 2010 had more impact than the 9/11. for us in Paris airport. So I was wondering, is there an international cooperation about this matter, about sharing information and do some preventive action to help airlines and airports to face this risk? Thank you.
I'll take that one. Yes, there is. Actually, there was very much under the auspices of the International Civil Aviation Organization, task forces and workshops were set up to gather the information. So, and there is active, and the plans for North Atlantic and the plans for Europe have been coordinated, so they are already set there. The shift in responsibility is very clear. There are regular exercises taking place in order to ascertain how the individual actors will work, because like Willie pointed out, how individual airlines will behave in this they will not be all behaving in the same way, so we have to get the experience of dealing with different behaviors of airlines. So there's very active international work in this area at present time. So the effect will never be, in my view, the same as it was in Eyjafjallajökull, except an eruption like Ingvar was promising is extremely big.
Any further questions?
Andrea Hein from the Ministry of Research in Germany. What are your expectations for future eruptions in the near future? Lived in Indonesia, and there was a lot of expectations always about the Merapi, but it finally broke out at a time when people were not absolutely expecting it. Do you have any sense of what's going to happen? Thank you.
That is very, very difficult to answer, because we are, of course, monitoring all these volcanoes quite thoroughly, and we have invested a lot in collaboration with a good support from ICAO for expand radars and other instruments that we can really follow much better on where the ash is going and how it is traveling. We can estimate better what the mass flow rate and also the total mass of the ash into the atmosphere. Based on that, of course, we have also implemented the models that we are running on a daily basis now, and of course, in collaboration with the London WAC and other WACs in Europe, we are expecting to have a much better information about all these ash traveling in the atmosphere on a next eruption. But of course, based on that, we have to provide this information to the airlines, because they make the decision. We just simply give them the data to work on, and our services, and they decide if they are going to use it or not.
Okay, I think we have to make room now for the next session, so thank you very much for attending.